Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Demystifying IRT Terminology. My name is Edward, and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 45 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speaker. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved, so please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speaker throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future streaming. A big thanks to Y-Prime, who helped develop the content for today's webinar. Y-Prime offers more than a decade of focused work with eClinical systems to expedite and improve the quality of patient management, clinical supplies, drug accountability, and clinical data. Cloud-based interactive response technology and electronic clinical outcome assessment platforms offer sponsors greater speed, precision, and integration in clinical trial management. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. As Vice President of Strategic Solutions at Y-Prime, Brian Clayton collaborates with biopharma executives, clinical operations, and supply teams to define, plan, and implement eClinical technology. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to hand the mic over to Brian Clinton for today's presentation. Brian, you may begin when you are ready.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It is my pleasure to be presenting on this topic. It's one that's very near and dear to my heart. So in today's discussions, we plan to define a few key terms in the IRT world, mainly configuration and customization and what they mean, what they don't mean. We'll also talk a little bit about some software development lifecycle methodologies and how configuration and customization can contribute to agile, waterfall, and other SDLCs. From there, we'll talk about some common applications in IRT design and certainly follow up with some question and answer. Before we go too far down our presentation, I'd like to start with just a few assumptions about what configuration might be, what customization might be. And many sponsors are able to work in the context and the framework of IRT standards. When we find IRT standards are in place, we find that configurability becomes very easy and very quick to implement. With that said, not all sponsor organizations or CROs have quite the volume of study work on an annual basis to really justify spending the time to develop standards. So with that said, there oftentimes becomes needs for customized functionality, and there are several different ways in which this can be positive, and sometimes there are some ways where this may impact you, your timelines, your cost, and your risk. Now, before we go too much further, I believe we have a polling question.
Thank you, Brian. That is correct. We do have our first polling question of the day for today's webinar. I have launched that on our audience screen to vote on. All watching live can vote on today's poll in real time, so we do encourage everyone to do so. Today's poll asks, how configurable is your IRT system today? And the answer options for this poll are 100% configurable, 80% configurable and 20% customized, 50% configurable and 50% customized, 20% configurable and 80% customized, or is your IRT system today 100% customized? Again, our audience can vote on this poll in real time by clicking one of the options available. How configurable is your IRT system today? 100% configurable, 80% configurable and 20% customized? Is it 50% configurable and 50% customized, 20% configurable and 80% customized, or is your IRT system 100% customized? And it looks like most of our audience has voted on that poll. Thank you everyone for doing so. And I'd now like to share those results. 50% of our audience voting that their IRT system is 80% configurable and 20% customized. 25% of the audience voting 50% configurable and 50% customized, 17% of our audience voting 100% customized, and 8% voting 20% configurable and 80% customized. Very interesting results. With that, I'll pass the mic back over to you, Brian.
Yeah, I agree, and thank you all for voting there. I'm not surprised to hear that the largest bucket here is 80% configurable and 20% customized. I think for a long time in the IRT world, we've been searching for the 100% customizable IRT system. And I think more and more of us are starting to realize that that may never exist. So this 80% configurable and 20% customized bucket is one that we see fairly commonly across all of our sponsors. Now, our next step here is I want to take a moment and put you all in a position where we can understand a little bit about interpreting requirements and a little bit about the difference on the ground between customization and configuration. So you all have a role. Today, you are going to be our developers. And by developer, I'm going to ask you to draw a picture. So grab your pen, grab your paper right there at your desk. And you today are an illustrator, and I am your project manager. So I have just spoken with our client, and they have asked us to draw an animal based on the specification document that I'm going to give you in a moment. Again, I'm the project manager, you're our developer, so I hope you've got your pen and paper in hand. So I'm going to pass my requirements over to the animators, which are all of you on the call today, and you're going to help us bring our specifications to life. Okay, here we go. First specification. Our animal has a long neck, and our animal is able to carry human riders. So take a minute, and I hope that you've got your pen in hand and you're starting to draw that animal based on the requirements that I, your project manager, gave you. I'll give you just a minute here to finish up. I know many of you are wonderful artists, so perhaps one day we'll be able to share our animations. And here we go. I've gotten all of your artwork back from the developers. You did a great job. I'm going to send this artwork over to our customer, and I'm sure they're going to be thrilled with it. Is that what you drew? Did you produce the ostrich that has a long neck and is able to carry human riders? Well, I've got bad news. I heard from the client, and they said, that's not at all what I was expecting. So I'm going to have to ask you to redo this. Now, don't worry. I already contacted the other client whose work you're working on right now and told them that we're going to delay their project because we have to do some other stuff. They weren't happy about it, but I took care of it. And don't worry, I already also contacted the boss and said, hey, we have to redo this work. So we're probably going to lose some of our profit margin. It is going to be a break-even study. But at the end of the day, we need our client to be happy. So here's requirements number 2. 4 legs. It's brown, it has a long neck, a tail, and is also still able to carry human riders. So take another minute with that pen and paper. Let's draw requirement version number 2. And then I'm going to take that finished product that you guys do for me and send it back over to the client. I'm positive they're going to be happy this time. All right. Here we go. I send it over to the client. Oh, no, I heard back from the client, and they said, that's not at all what we thought we were going to be getting from you. So unfortunately, it looks like we're going to have to do this again. Don't worry. I told the other clients again that we have to delay the other work because we have to redo this. And I told the boss that, hey, we're going to lose money on this project now because we're redoing it for a 3rd time. But with your pen and paper in hand, the requirements are the same, with the exception that this time it doesn't have a hump back. So your drawings are all out there, just about done. I appreciate all of your effort on this. Thank you for being diligent. And here's our final product. I sent it over to the client, and guess what? They loved it. Thank goodness. Now, my apologies that it took us 3 times to get this done. My apologies that we had to delay other clients' work in order to get this right. And my apologies that we ended up losing money on this project. What if next time we find ourselves in this position? We give our client the option through configuration. There's no pen required here. All you need to do is select which animal you would like. Now, That's probably a pretty standard exercise, and hopefully everyone is walking away from that thinking the first time, hey, I got it right. I got the horse the first time. Some of you are probably over there thinking, actually, I still think it was a giraffe. But I think you're starting to see the point here. When we spend our time on customization and configuration and specification documents, and we don't allow our customers to see the product we're working on in real time, our risk of getting it wrong becomes rather high. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but before we do, I'd like to just get everyone on the same page about some terms that we're going to deal with today. First, in our work, our line of business, there are many, many different names for the same thing. IRT, or Interactive Response Technology, means the same thing as IVRS, which is Interactive Voice Response Systems, IWRS, Interactive Web Response Systems, IXRS, which is a trademarked term, and RTSM, which means Randomization and Trial Supply Management. All the same thing, just with different names. Similarly, in IRT, we also talk about do not dates. A good friend of mine also calls these DNX. DNX dates are the same as stopping dates. In essence, do not ship or do not dispense, or stop shipping, stop dispensing. A common question folks often ask me is, does that mean this is the last date in which this drug can be dispensed, or is this the first date that the drug will not be dispensed? If you don't know the answer to that question, I suggest that you ask your project manager and you start to talk to your teams and find that answer out. There could be major implications. Yet another one that we talk about is forecasting period, look ahead period, short window. These are all the same terminology as well when we talk about resupply strategies. Just because one person calls it a forecasting period doesn't mean that they don't have a predictive resupply module. They just may call it a look ahead period. Now, the last one here is this, configurability and customization. These are probably the most commonly used and misused descriptors as far as IRT functionality goes. And that's what I'd like to unpack just a little bit more. So next, I'm a big fan of Stephen Covey and his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The second habit he talks about in that book is to begin with the end in mind. And let's do that right now. What does an IRT system need to be configurable? Or excuse me, why does an IRT system need to be configurable? Well, there's 3 main points. We're trying to reduce time, we're trying to lower risk, and at the end of the day, save you money, reducing cost. When you can develop a configurable IRT system, you're going to be able to do these things. I'll take it one step further. When sponsors are able to develop IRT standards, that's the most effective way to lowering cost, reducing risk, and minimizing your time. Not all sponsors are able to introduce standards, though, as we said before, simply based upon study volume. That's okay. Your IRT provider most likely has standard functionality built into their system that you can take advantage of. Now, with that said, everyone wants to reduce time, risk, and cost. Why would you ever want to customize? Well, fair question. There will be times, though, where an IRT system, as we said before, 80% configurable, 20% customized, will need some sort of additional functionality. And that could be based upon the complexity of your clinical trial. We all know that clinical trial designs are getting more and more complex every day. We also know that integrations between different systems have become very, very popular. Most recently, I've seen a large uptick in things like e-consent and things like patient engagement that require integrations across different e-clinical systems. And the last one, to me, the most exciting one, is innovation. We all want to do something else to help engage our patients and to help create innovative trials and really design the trials of the future that will help our patients and get drug to market faster. And with that, I would like to make sure we all are hearing the big takeaways. Configurability can save you time, can save you risk, can save you money, and customization means you have to have custom developed code. Custom developed code means that you have to have full end-to-end validation. Full end-to-end validation means it's going to take you time, and yes, time means money. Next, let's give you a quick example. Within the IRT world, there are predefined and pre-validated modules for things like screening, run-in, dispensing, and so on. And these predefined modules could either be based on the sponsor or the CRO standards, or as I said before, the IRT providers' standards that they have for their modules. Now, a common question is, well, who is doing the building of these standard modules? And that answer could be many different things. Oftentimes, providers like Y Prime have a configuration engineer who's able to configure screening forms and dispensing forms on behalf of the sponsor. From time to time, sponsors may have an internal IRT group or may have an internal subject matter expert who has access to a back-end design tool. And the last one that I find fairly commonly is that CROs oftentimes have certified designers who build IRT systems on a third-party platform. Any of these instances work, and they all have the same two common items here, and that is they're predefined and pre-validated. And from that point, you can simply drag the functionality into the system. It's a super fast configuration, and in this case, I just created a very simple study that needs screening, randomization, IP dispensing visits, and then an end of study. If I can define my standards, I can tie those standards to my functionality in the IRT system. That is how fast I can build a new system. Now, there certainly are caveats. The screening form itself may need additional configuration. Perhaps we need to identify which type of study this screening form is being used for. Is this study an open label study? Is it a single blind study, a double blind study? Is it an oncology study that perhaps requires additional collection during the screening period? And then from there, we also need to consider things like how are we capturing the dates of birth or ages of patients. We all know that regulatory bodies have created a few different rules as far as what you can or can't capture on a country-by-country basis. From time to time, we know that we will be able to capture year only, and from time to time, we know that we can't capture anything. We can only ask what is the subject's age. If your screening form has additional configurability in order to display things differently simply by using drop-downs, by using checkboxes, then you've put yourself in a position where your risk-based validation effort simply means you need to verify that things have been configured correctly, rather than doing end-to-end full scenario-based testing. That right there is where you begin to save time. And you're saving time because you're not writing custom code, and that reduces risk. Now, beyond that, there's more and more advanced functionality that's been requested in the IRT world. As an example, Y Prime has been asked to build calculations inside of the IRT system. We've also been asked to create an if this, then that type of scenario within the IRT system. And the analogy that I use here is think about your smart home. Smart homes recently have become very popular, being able to control things like your light switches, things like your garage doors by simply using the power of your voice or the power of your home assistant module. So recently I installed a garage door opener at my house, and I configured a rule in this if this then that type of mentality. If it is 10 o'clock at night and my garage door is still open, automatically send me a text message. I also created another one. If the garage door is open and I lock the front door, automatically close the garage door. This type of if this then that functionality is the type of thing that our customers have asked us for, and at Y Prime we've built. The last thing is business logic. After I enter information into a web form and I hit the submit button, I hit the send button, save button, whatever it might be in your system, what happens? Do we dispense drug? Do we randomize a patient? Do we randomize a patient and dispense drug? And can I configure what happens on the server side? Well, the answer now is yes. So Y Prime's calculation module is incredibly powerful and able to take things like demographics collected from the screening form, multiply them by different values that are constants on the back end of the system, and manage things like weight-based dosing, which is very common in today's clinical trials. Beyond that, Y Prime has built a business rules engine that allows us to compare values and determine functionality. Again, this is the if this then that. As an example, if the site is active, or if the site active equals true, if the patient status equals screened, and if the question is the subject over 18 years old equals option 1, and in this case we can assume option 1 equals yes. If all three of these ifs return true, then this subject is eligible for randomization. This type of configuration allows us to go beyond what previous configuration had allowed for. The last one, as far as business logic is concerned, simply is what happens after I hit that submit button. And using simple drag and drop methodology here, I can define what will happen after I collect my variables and hit go. Now, I do feel as though we oftentimes step over reports and data transfers and those types of things when we talk about this functionality, and I don't want to make that mistake right now. Report configuration is perhaps one of the more complex areas as far as IRT functionality goes. It's important first to consider what data we're putting into the reporting grid, and how does that data get there? Are we generating data based upon a query, or are we generating data based upon calculations? And the difference there can determine, again, how much validation, how much testing will go on. Now, beyond that, if we're pulling data from a table, there's probably some back-end information like a primary key or an ID number that we might not want to display in those data tables. So how can we configure a table to only display certain information into our reporting grids? And then how much of that is displayed? If we're trying to display thousands and thousands of rows in a web browser, most likely it's going to create performance problems. So how can we filter and just display maybe 100 or maybe 50? And can these reports be exported? And how configurable is the export? Can I configure a report to be exported as a PDF document? Can I configure it to be exported as an Excel document? Then lastly, maybe the most important, what are the blinding implications? IRT systems have a tremendous amount of data, and very much of it, if not all of it, can be unblinding in a blinded trial. It's extremely rare for someone to just overtly and on purpose become unblinded. Most of the time, it's an accident, or it's someone finding one piece of information in one report, another piece of information in a second report, and putting them together and figuring it out and saying, uh-oh, I think I figured something out. So it's important to consider in report configuration, what are the unblinding implications? Now, let's jump to the customizable side of things here. We've talked a lot about configuration. Is it important to remain customizable? In my opinion, yes, absolutely. You will never know when you need new functionality, or you'll never know when a new technology becomes available that you'll need to integrate with. And then, as we mentioned before, new reports are extremely common. Now, all of these things have two common themes. Customization requires a software developer. Customization then also requires a software tester. If you're customizing something, a developer is writing code, and a tester has to test that code. So before, we talked about a requirements exercise, and no, I'm not going to ask you to get your pen and pencil again, but we can talk through this one. We're going to create a new report, and this report will be based upon some simple requirements, and here they are. We're going to count subjects per country, and we're going to group them by screened, randomized, and completed treatment. Sounds pretty straightforward. And here's version 1 of our report. So here in our first version, you can see that I have 2 patients randomized in the US. But wait a minute. How can I have 2 patients that were randomized if I have no patients that were screened? And South Africa, how can I have 4 patients that have completed treatment, but none of them were ever randomized? Well, us folks in the IRT world and all of the clinical operations folks here on the line as well probably recognize that this report is showing us the current counts of subjects within these statuses, not the historical count. So we go back to our developers. Hey, that wasn't what the client wanted. We got to redo this. And we all say it again, we're going to lose a little bit of profit margin on our side, and the customer is going to lose timelines on their side, and no one wins here. So I go back to my developers, I ask them to rewrite it, and this is what they come up with. And we send this to the client, and the client says, what the heck is that? Well, I mean, it's a beautiful visualization. And everyone wants great visualizations these days in the reporting. Yeah, but the customer took a look at it, and they don't know what the heck this means. They can't figure out which status is which. They can't figure out which country is which. That's not going to work at all. All right, let's redo it one more time. Well, here's our next instance. I can see that we have screened 2/6 of a person at the USA, and we have randomized 2/4 of a person. And wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense either. So finally, here's what we were looking for. The last version of our report in the USA, based upon the headers, there are 2 subjects in screening out of a total of 6 subjects. There are 2 subjects that have been randomized, excuse me, there are 2 subjects in the randomization phase out of a total of 4 that have been randomized, and there are 2 subjects that have completed treatment. You can see that building reports, interpreting requirements is difficult, especially in reporting. So what are some tools and some takeaways that you have after listening to this presentation? Well, first off, ask questions. When your teams come to you in a bid defense or perhaps in a sales meeting and you ask, could we configure this or could we customize that? If they say, yes, that's configurable, I encourage all of you to respond to that by saying, how is it configurable? Who's doing the work? Is it a developer or is it a configuration engineer? If they say, well, it's a developer, challenge them again. If it's a developer, then it's not configurable. A developer writes custom code that then needs to be tested by a validation engineer. If it's configurable, challenge your folks even further. Say, are you able to show me that configuration right now in front of us, or is it something that you would have to have someone do on the back end of the system? Again, all of the answers to these questions aren't right or wrong, but it's important that you educate yourself and understand that sometimes when we say something is configurable, not everyone understands the same technical details, and it actually may take more effort than we think. On the cautiously optimistic side, please allow yourself to be innovative. Allow yourself to imagine the things that your software can do. Allow yourself to imagine the ways that we can better impact our subjects, ease of use throughout the trial, and imagine how we can get drug to market faster to help support our patients. Now next, I would be remiss if we didn't talk at all about system development life cycles. Configuration, in my opinion, is very tied to the agile methodology. But before we get too far into that, I'd like to ask a few questions about your studies and whether or not you have ever had problems with the IRT system getting in the way of something like Go Live.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And with that, we do have another poll question for our audience here. This is a multiple answer poll. And so for the audience, please feel free to select all options that apply to you. And this question asks, have you ever delayed the following because the IRT system wasn't ready? And so have you ever delayed initial shipment of IP to sites? Have you ever delayed first patient screened? Have you ever delayed a site initiation visit because the IRT system wasn't ready? And or have you ever delayed subject randomization? Again, our viewers can vote on this poll right now in real time, and it is a multiple answer selection. So feel free to select as many answer options that apply to you. Again, have you ever delayed the following because the IRT system wasn't ready? The following being initial shipment of IP to sites, first patient screened, site initiation visits, and or subject randomization. And it looks like most of our audience have voted. Thank you all for doing so. I'd now like to close that and share the results. And at 88%, most of our audience selected first patient screened being delayed the most because of their IRT system not being ready. The second most selected option was initial shipment of IP to sites at 63%. And then we have a tie here for the third most selected option, at 50% for both, being site initiation visit as well as subject randomization. And so with those results, Brian, I'll pass the mic back over to you.
Well, thank you for that. And wow, we as an industry in the IRT world, we need to do better. It's not okay for us to look at these numbers and see that more than half of you have had all of these things happen to you and create delays in your studies, especially something like randomization, first patient screened, where we're really impacting patients and their ability to receive medication. So what can Y Prime do in order to make sure that IRT is not on the critical path? Well, let's take a look at the software development lifecycle for a moment. For as long as IRT has been around, we've been talking mainly about the waterfall methodology, but there are others out there. Prototyping is a common one. Spiral is another common one. But within our world, waterfall has been the most common. With all software development life cycles, there's a few common considerations, and we're going to go into those in a little bit more detail. Now, there's this other idea about the agile methodology, and in my opinion, it's a great way to get IRT off the critical path. Well, why does IRT get on the critical path in the first place? Well, we can see here from the sponsor's perspective, many sponsors who I've spoken to over the years say, well, IRT specifications are 250 pages long, and we don't have time to review all those, so they're on the critical path. They also say, look, build timelines are too long. We need to have these systems out the door in 4 to 6 weeks because we just don't have enough time to get these built. And the last thing is they look at validation and testing. Why does it take 2 weeks to validate and test the system? From the IRT provider's perspective, well, oftentimes we're looking at for final protocol before we can really begin to finalize specifications. We also know that final protocol is very rarely available when you're selecting your IRT provider and signing the statement of work. Now, beyond that, specification sign-off is also required. As a matter of fact, the FDA guidance for industry on computer system validation says that in order to properly validate a system, you need to write test cases against enumerated requirements. Well, if we don't have the specifications signed off when we go into validation, we can't write test cases against enumerated requirements. And then lastly, from our perspective, UAT from time to time can go as fast as 1 day. And then we're not on the critical path. However, I do know that some sponsors, some CROs prefer to take a little bit longer. Sometimes I've seen it go as long as 2 weeks. Now, in this case, from our perspective on the provider side, we see that as perhaps a little bit longer and putting IRT back onto the critical path. Now, again, none of these are right, none of these are wrong, but they all do exist. So how can we work around that? Well, the Agile Manifesto talked about this idea of working software over comprehensive documentation. Now, we're going to come back to that a little bit more in the end, but the focus here in the Agile methodology is working software. And we also allow you to see the software many times before it goes live. So in this particular graph here, there is a high amount of visibility. Every 2 weeks or so, you're going to see your system, you're going to see the working software, and then at the end, by the time you're going into UAT, you've already seen the system 3, 4, maybe 5 times. In the waterfall methodology, though, it's similar to our drawing exercise before and our report requirements gathering exercise we did earlier today as well. You won't see your software while it's being developed. As a matter of fact, the first time you'll see your software may not even be until UAT. And perhaps when you were looking for your horse, you ended up with the ostrich. One of the other things that I think is valuable is the idea of configuration and customization as related to Agile and waterfall. The top line here, the darker blue or purple line that you see on your screen, is akin to the Agile methodology. You can see here that 8 weeks before go live, even all the way up to 5 weeks before go live, the ability to change is very high. On the waterfall side, though, the ability to change decays rapidly. And that is simply because once custom code is written, the ability to rip out that custom code and rewrite it will take time. When you use configuration and combined with the Agile methodology, though, we're changing things like drop-down menus, checkboxes, radio buttons, and that type of thing. Now, all of this also ties into risk, like we talked about before. If you have 8 weeks before your study is ready to go live, and you're still customizing and writing custom code at 4 weeks, you have a lot of risk. If you're using the Agile methodology with configurable software, you can see that your risk decays rapidly. And 4 weeks before your system is ready to go live, you have greatly reduced the risk of missing your timelines or going over budget. Now, speaking of missing timelines and going over budget, let's talk for a moment about the cone of uncertainty. Now, in this graph, you can see here that we're starting our cone of uncertainty in our timeline at final protocol, followed by kickoff meetings, specifications, and so on, leading all the way up until our system goes live. Now, to the left here at final protocol, it may take longer or it may not take as long. Really, we don't have a whole lot of confidence that we will be able to achieve this go live within this time point when we're very early on in the project. Well, how can we reduce that confidence? How can we get closer so that, yes, we know that we're going to be able to hit that 8 weeks? In my opinion, it's through configurability and the use of the Agile methodology. For those who are using a fully customized system, or a system that is 50% customized and 50% configurable, which is 25% of the people on our call today, this cone of uncertainty may be very wide on the configuration side. Excuse me, on the customization side. So next, what are regulatory bodies saying about the idea of configuration in the Agile methodology? Well, remember this, what we talked about before, working software over comprehensive documentation? That's exactly what the Agile methodology talks about in the Agile Manifesto. But keep in mind, we're not talking about working software instead of comprehensive documentation. It's working software over comprehensive documentation. It's critical that your system is still well documented. However, a great specification document that feeds software that doesn't work is not going to support your trial. So in my eyes, the Agile methodology is the perfect way to ensure that you have working software. However, you still need to require that your providers are giving you comprehensive documentation. All right, the requirements within your documentation, as we said before, need to be enumerated so that you can write test cases against them. And it's also important that our requirements are being reviewed and tested throughout the entire process of development. The Agile methodology ensures that. We said before, the computer system validation is a series of activities that occurs throughout the entire SDLC. So a couple quick things that come from some GFI from the FDA. The guidance does not recommend a specific life cycle. So that means we can use Agile, we can use waterfall, prototyping, spiral, we can use all kinds of different methodologies. However, it does ask that these verification activities be conducted throughout the entire software development lifecycle, which Agile supports. We go a little bit further into some of the medical device manufacturers, which do recommend taking an iterative approach to design and development. So do regulatory bodies say that Agile works? Well, not explicitly. However, what they're asking for is well supported by the Agile framework. So what I hope you've heard today over this presentation is 4 key points. First off, customization equals time and money. There may be times when you need it though. Be creative with what you're trying to develop, but also be fair. If you're asking your IRT providers or any other e-clinical system providers to develop something that's custom, make sure that you understand it's going to take their developers and testers additional time to write custom code. After they take that additional time to write the code, they're going to have to test it. This is all in the spirit of delivering working software. So work within your framework, particularly of your standards if you have them. When standards are in place, your ability to meet timelines, to reduce cost, and minimize risk will be incredible. And lastly, ask your provider. If you're asking for customization, is there another way that we could do this in a configurable manner inside of your system? As an example, maybe you want it to be magenta, but is there a way that we could make it pink? Because that would be good enough for us. Those types of questions can oftentimes avoid any sort of problems with study delays and increased costs and change orders.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Brian, for that insightful presentation. Now, I would like to continue to invite our audience to send in their questions or comments using the questions window for the Q&A portion of this webinar. I've already received some questions, and so let's get started with those. This first audience member asking, how can project teams be empowered to enforce their standards and configurability?
Such a great question. I think one of the things I've seen in my career is sponsors who have standards in place, however, don't enforce those standards. One of the things that creates is a confusion about, well, are there standards or not? So really, I think it's important, if nothing else, that we communicate. We communicate up front within the sponsor organization. I would encourage clinical project management teams and really sponsor companies across the board to make sure that if standards are available, everyone is aware of them. Number 2, I would also ask that vendors, providers of great IRT systems, like Y Primes, that we say upfront in our kickoff meeting, hey, these are the standards that I have been given by your company. In the event that we go outside of these standards, I would like to ask your permission that we talk about the increase in scope, and that may be in the form of time or in the form of budget. Asking those things up front and being crystal clear with our communication.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much for that answer, Brian. Another question for you here. This viewer asking, well, stating first, on the sponsor side, there are two client groups, the study team usually blinded and the supply manager usually unblinded, and then follows up by asking, how can the systems be adapted to serve both needs?
Oh, such a good question. So the modern IRT systems like Y primes are configurable even down to the data field level. And what we mean by that is specific user roles can simply be configured as blinded or unblinded. Specific data points can also be configured as blinded and unblinded. Now, robust IRT systems have business logic built and in place that will prevent blinded users from receiving or seeing unblinded data. So I would simply say, by taking advantage of configuration tools available in modern IRT systems, the blinded user roles and blinded data, blinded user roles and unblinded data should never be able to cross paths simply based upon business logic.
All right, excellent. Thank you for that answer. Another one for you here. This audience member asking, how can customized features roll into future configurations to support long-term gains in efficiency?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, to be honest, because from time to time we'll develop standards, and those standards will be rather robust. And then the sponsor has a need to change. Let's go back to our screening form example we had before. That example we had earlier in the slide deck was really only giving us 4 different configuration options. Well, what if there was a 5th? Rather than asking what the subject's date of birth was, what if we just needed to ask, well, what is the age of the subject? Well, that seems like something we have to customize. We have to customize the configurability. Now, once that customization is done, great SDLCs are able to take that change and roll that back into the base product. So that would be my question that I would ask teams to communicate about is, are we able to roll our changes? Are we able to roll our modifications back into a base product so that they're available for future implementations?
All right, excellent. Thank you very much, Brian, for that answer. And it looks like we have reached the end of our Q&A session for this webinar. If we weren't able to attend to your questions today, the team at YPri may try to follow up with you after today's event. If you have any further questions, please do direct them to the email address showing on your screen. That's bclayton@ypri.com. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for today's event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. I've just sent everyone a link in their chat box. You can say thanks to our speaker today via LinkedIn by clicking on that message. So I encourage everyone in joining us once more and thanking our speaker. Brian, thank you again for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
We hope you all found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone.